Sarika began to remember the blood banquet and the death of her fiancé. She did not know how Cyan knew about all this. She started to stare at him suspiciously since the fact that he was her fiancé was something that Cyan could not have known. So she asked him again how he knew all this. Cyan remained calm and explained that Drenian was someone he had to purify anyway, asking if it mattered, to which Sarika replied that yes. Her eyes filled with emotion, and with a smile she assumed it was possible that Cyan was a spy from another organization. He started to look at her and asked her what would happen if he were a spy from another organization. Sarika unsheathed the dagger and it began to emit a powerful energy, and she asked him if it wasn't obvious what was going to happen. With a serene look, Cyan began to observe her, and at that moment, the black fog started to appear. Sarika jumped and launched a powerful attack towards Cyan. But at that moment, a barrier made of black fog appeared in front of him and blocked the attack. Sarika began to retreat, and she couldn't help but start smiling upon seeing that she was getting in her way. The person who had blocked the attack was none other than Karam. She transformed from black fog to human form, started looking at Sarika, and realized that she never learned. She thought she had made it clear to her that she could not lay her hands on her owner. Far from stopping, Sarika drew the two daggers, began to advance towards them, and with a smile told her that she was the one who did not learn, adding that she was enjoying this situation. Seeing this, Karam prepared to counterattack using her claws, and she could not help but start to get angry and smile since for her Sarika was a very annoying person. Both clashed. Sarika attacked again using the daggers, but Karam jumped back and dodged the attack. Seeing this, Sarika attacked again, but once again Karam jumped and dodged the attack without much effort. While she was in the air, she tightly gripped her claws, making a powerful ball made of black fog appear. She began to look at Sarika and with a smile decided to show her something interesting. Sarika couldn't help but start smiling, and it didn't take long for her to realize that it was coming. Karam used the black fog's power technique called adamant, and she launched the ball of black fog towards the ground, which impacted forcefully in the area where Sarika was, destroying the ground into pieces. But in reality, the black fog ball passed by Sarika's side. She started to look at Karam and mocked her since it didn't matter how strong the ability was, she could simply dodge it. But to her surprise, the black fog ball was so powerful that it created a large explosion behind her, causing her to go on alert. She started to look back, and upon seeing this, she couldn't help but be shocked. This was Karam's true power. If she had been hit by the attack or had tried to deflect it, she would have died on the spot. Karam put her hand on her waist, spat, and began to feel frustrated since she had failed. Sarika finally understood why she stayed in sword form most of the time. If she wanted, she even had the power to destroy an entire city. Everything that had stood in the way of the black fog ball had been annihilated without leaving any trace. To stop someone like Karam, Sarika needed at least the Demon King. Karam started licking her lips, and with a smile, she asked Sarika to get ready since what happened before was just a warm-up. She started to blush and with a smile full of excitement decided to give her best, but to everyone's surprise, Cyan controlled the demon sword, making Karam fall face down against the ground, leaving poor Sarika in shock, and causing her to go on alert. Karam's face hit hard against the ground, and all her body began to be crushed by immense pressure. She got a little angry as she was just getting ready to fight. Cyan, who was somewhat furious, started to smile and called her attention. He was very angry since if she caused all this commotion, they would all be discovered, calling her an idiot. Sarika, who had been excited about the fight, had a reality check and she realized this was true. Cyan decided to tell Brian and the others to move to another place. He opened the door of the house, clenched his teeth tightly, and decided to let those two take care of things outside. After saying this, he slammed the door shut. Karam stopped feeling the pressure and sat down. Both she and Sarika started looking at the door and remained thinking in silence. Cyan entered the interior of the house, put his hand on his forehead and told them that there had been a change of plans and ordered them to pack right now. Someone was happy to see that Cyan had returned, and upon hearing the voice, little by little he began to open his eyes and couldn't help but start wondering what was happening. In front of him were Brian, Nana, and Emily, and at the table sat a woman with blue hair, who had her head resting on her hand. There was much more in the family than she expected. With a sincere look, Brian apologized to him, saying that she had appeared suddenly. Cyan was somewhat terrified to see that she had been able to cross the barrier and miss detection. With a confused look, he asked her how she had found out about this place. This woman was none other than Lunav. She began to observe Cyan and explained to him that this was one of her talents, asking him not to worry since only she knew about this place. In reality, she was much more skilled than Cyan had thought. She put her hand over her mouth and assumed that now she would not be the only one considering all that commotion outside. Upon hearing this, everyone became somewhat confused and started looking at Cyan. Realizing this, he decided to change the subject and asked her why she was here. With a tired look, she thanked him, saying that this was all she had to say to him. Cyan remained calm and with a serene look asked her what he had done for her to be thanking him. Lunav placed her hand on her chest and with a smile asked him not to worry since she knew his secret the moment he had entered her that day. Brian and Emily were somewhat confused and couldn't help but start to sweat. They approached Cyan and began to misinterpret the situation, wondering what that was supposed to mean. The only one who did not misinterpret the situation was the innocent Nana. Lunav was referring to that time when she had fainted and Cyan had transferred some of his mana thinking that she had lost consciousness. Lunav extended her hand to one side and invoked blue mana, then she extended the other hand and invoked fire mana. She brought her two hands together, started observing the mana and explained that she could use all elements of magic. She could combine them or change them, and also could track a person's specific mana. With a lost look, she asked Cyan if this wasn't cool. It was the gift that her grandfather had given her. Cyan began to observe the mana and with a suspicious look revealed that it was rather a curse, since her body had been broken. Lunav brought her hands together at the tips, and she couldn't help but start to blush, and with an excited look asked if he had been the one who had reassembled her body. After saying this, she decided that it was better to go somewhere else. Upon hearing this, Brian and Emily began to talk among themselves about what they were planning to do. Noticing this, Cyan gritted his teeth and ordered them to start packing. Emily started looking at Cyan and with a confused look asked where they were going. Cyan and Lunav stood up, approached the door, and he revealed that they were going to the Lewin Academy. Emily couldn't help but start blushing and feeling excited since she would be able to take care of Cyan every day. Brian started to feel disgusted at the thought that now he was going to have to eat Emily's disgusting food. Nana began to point at Brian with her finger and she asked him what was wrong with his face, to which he replied that he had mixed feelings. Lunav had been locked inside a tube, and she had been studied by many scientists. The reality was that she had spent most of her young days in that cold and dark place. She had to endure all kinds of painful experiments in that place. She had no other choice but to endure. One day she opened her eyes and saw her grandfather standing next to the tube, staring at her intently. This was her duty as the granddaughter of Raijin's Rainreaver. Back in the present, they started to walk around the area until they reached a wooden bridge, and she asked Cyan if he also had a duty to fulfill, to which he replied that he did not. She began to look at Cyan and with a confused look asked why he had saved them anonymously. He looked away, sighed, and explained that he did not want to be famous. It was a pain and he knew that she knew better than anyone why. Suddenly, she stopped walking and asked why. Then she extended her hand and began to invoke Cyan's black fog. This was his element. At first she had thought that it was darkness, but the day they had met in the restaurant, she had bumped into him and had collected a little mana from him. He started to observe her, and it didn't take long for him to realize that she could read the mana information of people just by touching them, something he did not know in his past life. The day she had fainted, Cyan had put his mana into her. The black fog that she had summoned became more intense. With a serious look she asked what this was. It seemed like his mana, and at the same time it did not seem of this world. The black fog began to spread everywhere. Cyan remained calm, started to observe it, and came to the conclusion that she had come to see him to take the mana to Raijin's. She clenched her fist, causing the black fog to disappear. She brought her fist close to her chest, started looking down and replied that she had no reason for doing that since it was going to be a pain. Cyan began to smile and asked her if she was rebelling against him. In response, she started walking towards him and she was sure that he could assume why. She pressed against Cyan's chest, closed her eyes, and thanked him for alleviating her ancient pain. He entered alertness and confusion at the same time. Lunav's body was like a boiling pot full of all kinds of mana elements. It was chaotic, but someone closed the lid of that pot to prevent the loss of mana, not knowing that this would lead to the pot overheating, and the mana that was spilling began to extinguish the fire of life, putting Lunav's life in danger. Cyan began to contemplate her with a sad look. He had decided to make a hole in that lid. He grabbed Lunav by the shoulders, making her somewhat surprised. In his eyes, this kid also seemed like someone else's puppet, and this was something that bothered him. He started to touch her shoulder and told her that there was no need to say thank you. He decided to leave if she had nothing else to say, and he also asked her to keep this secret. After saying this, he moved away from her, started waving goodbye with his hand, and explained to her that it was going to be dangerous if she exceeded again. She remained silent. The rays of the sun began to illuminate the area, and she couldn't help but smile and think that he was very cute. Cyan started to touch his chin and slowly began to move away, and Lunav was sure that he was a good person. After a few hours, in the Garam Association, more precisely in the president's office, Lunav's grandfather hit the table hard and got angry. The butler approached him, slightly bent his body before him and mentioned that fortunately there had been no charges, asking if they should send a petition, to which he responded with a no. He clenched his teeth tightly and with an angry look deduced that Lunav was standing elsewhere, and gave the order to the butler to find her and bring her back. The next day dawned and everyone got into the carriage. Brian, who was the driver, set course for the academy. Emily began to blush and she couldn't help but smile since she was very happy. Upon seeing this, Cyan became somewhat confused and asked her why she was so happy. Emily, who was sitting in front of him, closed her eyes and replied that she was happy since she would be able to serve him again. Nana, who was sitting next to her, simply remained silent. Emily began to look at him and remembered that she had heard that maids were not allowed in the academy. Cyan crossed his arms, and with a calm look asked her not to worry since he believed that this time the director was going to make a special exception. After a few hours, they arrived at the academy and Cyan went to the director's office. He started staring at him and refused to allow him to have a maid. Cyan, who had his arms behind his back, remained calm and asked him to allow him to have a maid, assuring that he was going to make sure that people did not notice her. The director asked him for a reason why he should make an exception. Cyan turned his head to one side, looked away and promised not to skip any lessons. He became enraged, hit the table hard as it was unnecessary to say so, since he had to do this normally. Moreover, Cyan wanted to have 2 maids instead of 1. He decided to ask something about this. Upon hearing this, Cyan's attention was fixed on the director, and he couldn't help but feel curiosity. With a serene look, he asked Cyan if the 2 of them were related to the blood banquet. He assumed that it wasn't for a stupid reason that he was asking for permission. Cyan began to look at the director and started to think in silence. He decided to tell him the reason if he gave him permission for it first. The director, who had his head resting on his hand, turned his head to the other side and gave him permission to do what he wanted, since anyway he was going to do it despite his objection. Cyan mentioned that it was difficult for him to explain it to him now, but he could tell him one thing with certainty. Upon hearing this, the director's gaze fixed on Cyan. Cyan's body began to emit a powerful energy, and his eyes started to shine. He began pointing at himself with his finger and with a smile assured that he was not behind the blood banquet, asking the director if this was not what he wanted to know. He started to stare at Cyan and asked him if he was sure about this. Cyan began to observe the director. He could not understand him. He started to get angry and asked the director how he saw him to assume this. The director decided to change the subject and asked him to make sure not to skip any lesson. After a few hours, the sun began to shine high in the sky and the conversation with Kundal went well. Cyan began to walk down the hallway and he couldn't help but wonder how he would react if he realized that the person behind the blood banquet was his own grandson. He started to imagine Lionel and his eyes filled with rage. For what he knew, it could not have been Lionel himself because he was not that meticulous. He started to imagine Ashel's bastard and Boris. Ashel had been the one who planned everything, and Boris who carried it out. In his past life, one day while he was walking, Ashel appeared, put his arm around his neck and with a smile started to talk to him, while on the other side Boris began to walk behind them. That was how they always did things. He approached his room and saw Seth doing push-ups in front of his door. He was sweating like crazy and had already done a total of 13 push-ups. Cyan started to watch him and felt somewhat confused. Seth noticed Cyan's presence, stopped doing push-ups and stood up. Now Seth had an even more muscular body than before. He put his hands on his waist, and with a smile decided to fight against him to see who was stronger. Just before Seth could finish speaking, Cyan entered his room and closed the door, leaving poor Seth standing there. At first he started to smile, but then he approached the door and began to knock. Cyan started to observe the door and he realized that he had not missed a day in the last 2 years. Seth assumed that Cyan was busy this time, so he decided to fight against him next time. While Cyan was walking, his foot bumped into someone's arm. He stopped walking and looking at the ground saw Brian lying on the floor and drooling. His pupils were white and he had lost consciousness. Cyan panicked and with a worried look began to wonder if he was dead. Upon seeing that he had returned, Emily appeared, and upon seeing her, Cyan began to point at Brian with his finger and asked her what had happened to him. Emily was holding a plate of cookies which was emanating a repugnant aura. She picked up a cookie, took a bite, and replied that she wasn't sure Brian had fallen asleep after trying the cookies she had made for Cyan. Behind her were Nana, who started eating the cookies as if they were the most delicious food on the planet. The cookies she had made for Cyan looked repugnant. She asked him if he wanted to try one. In the blink of an eye, Nana ate all the cookies. Cyan started pointing at Emily's plate and asked her not to cook something for Brian ever again. She put a hand on her hip and with a confused look asked the reason, to which he replied that it was an order. He sat down on the sofa, closed his eyes and sighed, as he was worried about the future. When he opened his eyes, he saw that there was a letter on the table. He was somewhat confused and asked where this letter had come from. Emily explained that Brian had received the letter and that she had no idea where it had come from. Cyan took the envelope with one hand and took out the letter with the other, and with a serious look, he started to wonder if it was from Lunav. At that moment, someone caught his attention. He turned his head to one side, and upon seeing who this person was, he began to sweat and couldn't help but be in shock and start to wonder how they had gotten in here. This person was none other than Lunav. With a smile, she asked him how he had been and revealed that she had run away from home. At the same time, in the sewers of the city, while the water was falling, a bright light appeared. Two hooded people carrying fire lamps began to walk through the sewer. One of them mentioned that the guards from the Garam Association were going to arrive soon, but the other asked him not to worry since he had taken care of it. One of them was an old man wearing glasses. With a serious look, he asked his companion not to forget that this was the only way to stop Raijan's Rainreaver. The other person was a woman with black hair. With a smile, she asked him if he was worried that she would feel guilty. He started to look at her and reminded her that she was her student after all. This woman was named Nayla Aranis, and she was one of the instructors at the Lewin Academy. While with one hand she was holding the fire lamp, she put the other hand on her chest and with a smile explained that she wasn't so foolish as to feel pity for a monster. The man thought that this was good. Nayla began to look at him with a pleasant gaze, and she decided to head to the place since she was sure that her colleagues had arrived up to Lunav. After saying this, she turned her back on the man and started to walk away from him. He placed his hand over his chest, bowed his head before her, thinking that this would bring glory to the kingdom of Garam. At the same time, it became evening and Lunav and Cyan went to a cafe in the city to have something. A few minutes ago, Cyan had taken her by the arm and both had left the academy. He wanted to avoid any misunderstanding. Lunav grabbed her wrist, and with a serene look, she thought that he was quite aggressive, since she did not expect him to drag her outside like that. Cyan picked up the cup of tea, and with a calm look remembered that there was a spell barrier at the doors of the dormitories. He did not know how she had been able to cross it. Lunav's hand began to release a powerful mana, and with a smile she explained that she had simply analyzed the barrier using her mana and had used a spell to cancel it. Cyan started to observe her. He was somewhat impressed, since her power was really impressive. She could analyze spells and undo them. That was more than just scanning. She closed her eyes and while she was laughing asked him if he had read the letter. He crossed his arms and explained that she had arrived just when he was going to do it. Lunav rested her elbows on the table, rested her head in her hands. She had simply come because she couldn't wait for his response. Cyan asked if Raijans had made her do this. Upon hearing this, she began to open her eyes and with a lost look, she started to think. With a threatening look, Cyan asked if it had been Raijans who had told her to get in touch with him. Lunav picked up the cup of tea, and after thinking for several seconds, replied that yes, at first that had been the only reason, but no longer. Although it depended on him to decide whether to trust her or not. He put his hands in his pockets. He did not trust others so easily, so he asked what her intentions were. Lunav, who was holding the cup of tea, revealed that recently in the association there had been some ominous events. 2 dragons that had been in contact with the association had suddenly disappeared from somewhere in the Lewin region. The people who had been smuggling items abroad had been found as cold corpses, and she had learned that he was involved in all of that. Upon knowing this, Cyan began to observe her with a serious look and remained silent. Lunav started to look him in the eyes, and she couldn't help but show a sincere smile. Until now it had only been an assumption, but now she was sure. Cyan closed his eyes and couldn't help but smile. He had no idea that dragons were associated with the association. He felt curious about what she was planning to do now that she knew this. She revealed that she was going to die soon. He opened his eyes and was in shock. With a lost look, Lunav began to stare at the ground, and despite the fact that he had helped her before, she knew her body's condition and was sure of this. A few years ago, while she was in the experiment tube, some hooded men dressed in white appeared and began to inspect the experiment. Now she was beyond repair. She put her hand on her chest and with a sincere look revealed that she had about 3 years left to live, thanking him for his help. Cyan started staring at her since he did not believe this. He did not know why she was so indifferent about it, nor did he know if it affected her in the slightest that she was going to die soon. Lunav closed her eyes and began to show a pleasant smile. She wished she could feel something. Cyan's eyes filled with fury, since according to him she was very annoying. He placed his hands on the table, stood up, started looking at the floor and decided to stop thinking about the topic since this was not his business. Seeing this, Lunav asked if he was going to leave. He turned his back on her, and while he was walking away, he sighed and explained that he did not like getting involved in annoying matters. Lunav, who was sitting, closed her eyes and with a smile began to say goodbye to him. Kara manifested, appeared next to him, and with a confused look she asked him where his manners were and also if it was okay to leave her here alone. Cyan didn't even pay attention to her, and with a serene look decided that it was better to leave her alone here. After a few minutes, a group of hooded men appeared and surrounded Lunav. The Garam Association had been waiting here for some time. She was somewhat surprised as she thought she had done a great job hiding. She closed her eyes and told them that they had come too early. One of the men started staring at her and told her it was time to go since Mr. Rygens was looking for her. She started to observe the man and fell silent. Upon realizing this, he asked her if something was wrong. With a confused look, she asked him who he was, since she remembered that it was always Victor who came to pick her up. The man became nervous and explained that Victor was busy today and for this reason he had come here in his place. They were from the 6th Security Branch. Lunav could not help but smile upon seeing that he was lying. In reality, she did not know anyone named Victor. She used the ability called Windy and attacked the man, causing his body to be thrown through the air. After doing this, she clenched her teeth tightly, got up from the chair, and began to flee. With a confused look, she started to glance back and could not help but begin to wonder if they were extremists. She decided it was better to get out of here as soon as possible. But at that moment, the hand of someone who was in front of her began to emit a powerful purple mana. That person used the ability called Sleep Catch and put their hand on Lunav's face, leaving her in shock. She panicked and with a surprised look thought that this was not good. Not long after, she fell to the ground, and one of the men started laughing since he did not expect it to be so easy to capture her. A bald man took off his hood and began to smile. Despite having captured Lunav, they had been caught too quickly. He ordered the others to take her to the carriage. In a matter of seconds, his spell worked and Lunav fell asleep like a log. Karam, who was not very far from the area, noticed this and she went on alert. She began to look in the direction where Lunav was, and with a serious look revealed that they were fighting. Cyan, who had his hands in the pockets of his pants, with a firm look turned his head back. He did not know if they were from Garam. He started to observe the men and remained still doing nothing. After a few hours, the men captured Lunav and left. And when night fell they arrived at a cathedral that was away from the city. After getting off, the bald man ordered the others to stay outside. He entered the interior of the cathedral and said that he had brought Lunav Rainreaver. Someone wearing a black hood was sitting on the bench and was the only person in the cathedral. According to her, Lunav was an unfortunate girl who had been experimented on all her life just to be used and discarded in the end. This person was Nayla. She began to observe the man and with a smile decided to use this kid for a good cause. Lunav, who was unconscious, was inside the carriage and had her hands and eyes bandaged. The carriage was being watched by several men. At that moment, a malignant mana began to appear. One of the men noticed this and with a confused look began to wonder what was happening. Black fog appeared and slowly began to spread through the area, causing the men to go on alert. One of the men who was watching the carriage thought that it could not be from mist, but at that instant, something sharp cut his head in half, as if it were bread, leaving the other man in shock. He turned around and saw that the body of another of his companions had been cut into pieces. Someone started to move quickly, and in the blink of an eye sliced the other men. Upon witnessing this scene, he began to sweat and with a terrified look began to wonder what was happening. He started shouting that it was enough. While he was distracted trying to understand the situation, Cyan, who wore a mask and had the sword resting on his shoulder, appeared above the carriage and began to stare at him. Upon feeling his presence, the man began to sweat like crazy and panicked, thinking that this was not good. Screams of pain started to be heard, and upon hearing this, the bald man who was inside the cathedral turned around and went on alert. He did not know what was happening. He approached the exit and saw that there was black fog outside. Nayla began to remove her hood and asked if there were other guests, to which he replied that someone had followed them. Nayla began to smile, thinking that it was an enemy. She gave the order to Ralph to show them what happened when someone tried to get in their way. Ralph became furious and with a determined look decided to go silence them. Outside, Cyan finished off all the men, and according to Karam it had been easier than she had thought. Cyan, who was holding the sword with one hand, started to look towards the cathedral since this had not ended. He knew that the strong guys were inside. Ralph came out of the cathedral and while his body was releasing a powerful blue mana, he began to approach Cyan and could not help but praise him since he was good despite being just a boy, asking if he had come alone. Although at first Cyan remained silent, then he started to stare at Ralph and told him that it did not seem to be the case for him. He also realized that this guy was like Lunav. Ralph clenched his fists, gained momentum, began to advance quickly towards him and prepared to attack, saying that he did not need anyone's help to defeat someone like him. Cyan assumed a defensive stance and it didn't take long for him to realize that he was more unstable than she was. After several minutes, Nayla left the cathedral thinking that Ralph had eliminated the intruder. Her eyes filled with surprise upon seeing what she was witnessing. She was in shock as she did not know what was happening. In front of her was a crater in the ground and in the middle was Cyan who was standing, and next to him was Ralph who had all his clothes torn and was on his knees. This was not something she had expected to see. Not long after, Ralph lost consciousness and fell to the ground. Now that he was out of combat, Cyan began to look at Nayla and asked if she was the last one. He wanted to know the reason why she wanted to capture Lunav. Nayla extended her hand towards him, making a fireball appear, and with a smile explained that he wasn't going to be popular with girls being so inquisitive. He should discover the answer for himself. Cyan began to remember Lunav, who joined both hands and started to combine the fire mana and the blue mana. He was somewhat surprised to see that she was like Lunav. Nayla used the technique called Thunder Flame and she launched some powerful bursts of fire towards him. Just before the attack could hit, Cyan moved to the side and dodged it with little effort. Now he had even more questions than before. He unsheathed the sword Karam and began to swing it forcefully, causing it to start releasing an intense mana. Upon seeing this, Nayla was left speechless, and with a confused look she thought that this could not be true. She began to summon even more powerful flames, but without much effort, Cyan started to deflect them using the sword. In the midst of the flames, Cyan approached her, started to stare at her intently and told her that he had caught her. Upon seeing this, she was left speechless and panicked. Cyan attacked her with a precise cut, but Nayla used the air leap ability, and just before the attack could hit, she jumped and dodged the attack, causing Cyan's sword to strike against the ground. While she was in the air, with both hands together, she prepared to attack, clenched her teeth tightly and decided not to leave him alive since he was someone very dangerous. She used the ability called Charge Shot, making a powerful mana ball appear. Instead of trying to dodge the attack, Cyan stood still, and at that moment, the sword began to emit the black fog which started to approach her from behind. While Nayla was distracted, Karam appeared behind her and caught her attention. She did not take long to realize that he was not alone. Karam grabbed her by the arms. She panicked and thought this was not good. She asked her to let her go, but Karam did not pay any attention. Cyan landed on the ground, and Karam modified the direction of Nayla's attack, making the mana burst pass by his side. It impacted against the cathedral, cutting it in half and destroying the entire area. Cyan, who had his arm resting on his knee, began to look to one side and saw that her mana continued through the area. He quickly realized that she had a lot of mana. Karam used her powers and the black mist transformed into shackles. Now Nayla could not move. With an aggressive look, she began to wonder what was happening. In a matter of seconds, the black mist became more powerful, causing her to fall to her knees on the ground. Karam, who was standing behind her, began to clean her hands and asked her to stop fighting, since no human could free themselves from these bindings. Cyan approached her and asked who had ordered Lunav's kidnapping. Nalam's attack was so powerful that the cathedral was cut in half, and there was still mana in the area. Cyan started looking at her and asked how many more of them there were. Nalam, who was unable to move, started looking at the ground and thought that he was a very interesting boy. She replied that he would find out soon. Her eye transformed into black dust and she began to disappear. She lifted her head and with a smile said that they were going to look for him and they would see each other in hell. Karam put her hand under her chin and with an inspecting look, came to the conclusion that judging by her reaction, she was from Heart Curb. Cyan also put his hand under his chin, began to observe her and remembered that it was an artifact that kept the user's mana in the heart, and that's why she hadn't been able to circulate it through her body. Upon hearing this, Nalem couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. With a smile, Karam assumed that Lunav had something similar. Nalem asked how she knew this. With a calm look, Cyan mentioned that the monstrous organization carrying out all the vile experiments in the Garam Association was the path of evolution. Nalem was shocked and began to wonder who they were and how they knew this. Cyan crouched down, started to stare at her intently, and mocked her, saying that she could find the answer for herself in hell. Her eyes filled with tears, and with a desperate look she thought that dying this way was not ideal. Just before she could say another word, Cyan placed a hand on top of her head and using the other gave her a strong punch in the chest, causing her to start writhing in pain. In his past life, he had found an ancient text in a laboratory room of the Garam Kingdom, where it was described how to use an article called Curve of the Heart and how to control it, as well as experiments related to it. In a matter of seconds, Nalem lost her life and her body began to disappear. Cyan's fist started to emit a powerful energy. The text also described how to eliminate it when its use had been a failure. In his hand he had the heart crub, and it was still functioning. Karam asked what he was going to use it for. He started to look at her and asked her to take Lunav out of the carriage. With a serious look she refused, but he asked her if she also wanted to be controlled. She had no other option and she took Lunav out of the carriage and put her on the ground. He approached her. This was his first time trying. He brought the heart crub close to his face, started to observe it, and he didn't know if it was going to go well. Without thinking much about it, he clenched his fist, destroying it into pieces. After doing this, he placed his hand on Lunav's chest, and it began to emit a powerful blue mana. Karam, who had her arms crossed and was beside her, remained silent. If Lunav had something like this in her heart, then this should be able to destroy it. Slowly, the heart crub began to enter her body, and several seconds later, she opened her eyes. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.